Trafalgar to Dreadnought, a century and 15 ships and battles. Now, before I really get into this, I've got to talk to you about some Latin. In fact, I've got to go into my posh voice, because this is how I learned it. Post hoc, ergo, propter hoc. Arthur, therefore, because of. Which is, as all those who studied Latin or the law will be able to tell you, is a traditional logical fallacy. At no point is this more true or more reflective than when one is looking at ship design. The honest fact is, and I know this accent is going to really wind up some of my American viewers, but I'm going to keep it up while I'm discussing Latin. The honest fact is that when you're looking at history, it can often seem easy pinpoints you can pick out. You can go to a battle and say, that happens there, so therefore that confirms that, and these come into existence. But more often than not, when we're talking about ship design, battles confirm ideas, or at least give some evidence which seems to support them, rather than actually originating ideas. Ideas do not come about because of a battle. They have been about before the battle. They're often being discussed before the battle. It's just, battles make good points for selling things. For example, we often use the Battle of Tsushima to justify the Dreadnought. Now, the reality is, there have been papers going around since before the Battle of Tsushima, and the armoured cruisers, which we'll be talking about, have been making their way towards a Dreadnought arrangement before the Battle of Tsushima. So, therefore, you are dealing with a system which in reality might seem, in a prima facie way, to be very easy, very obvious, but in reality is more complex and nuanced. And that is where we have to really think things through. That is where we really have to consider the nuggets of the information. So when we are going from 1805 to 1905, we have to look at several levels. Now, I say approximately century and 15 ships and battles because when I did the live, some people were very upset that HMS Devastation was not included. And the reason I hadn't included her was honestly because I was trying to keep it to 15. But that is life. And because I am nothing if not nice when I try to be, sarcastic but nice when I try to be, I have added her in. Anyway, so back to Battle of Trafalgar on my normal voice. Right now, the Battle of Trafalgar is one of these really interesting campaigns because they're going all around the world. They have got ships crisscrossing oceans. This is something you're not going to see again in battles till you really get to the Second World War. There are a few like this in the First World War, mainly the Battle of the Falkland Islands. And Coronel. But otherwise, the battles are mostly one side on the North Sea versus the other side of the North Sea. Which is really not that taxing for ships. The Battle of Trafalgar is also interesting because it is one of the last major battles which really takes place which are defined by wind as weather, i.e. the trade points, the flow of air, where ships come into, sailing ships come into if they're being driven by currents and wind, where they usually end up. This will still continue on, but as we go through the century, steam power is going to come in, and that's going to have to start as a factor. And other things start to play a factor. Weather is not just wind, and please, no one turn around and say that the moment you get steam engines in, weather stops being a factor in fighting, in naval warfare. It still is a major factor. I've just done a whole series of episodes on the Battle of Taranto, and not just was night a factor, the phases of the moon were a factor. The weather coming in, the likelihood of storms in future weeks was a factor in their timing. Even today, there are actually more weather factors as part of operations than there were less. Because as you get more advanced technology, more things start to become a factor. One of the things we have to deal with nowadays are solar flares. Yeah, the EM burst of radiation which tends to accompany them tends to have an impact on some of our communications equipment. Ouch. So, the Battle of Trafalgar is this big battle, and it sets the requirements for what navies are expected to achieve, especially in Britain, in terms of a resounding victory. Which means Britain has to build towards that resounding victory. But they're not quite sure what to build. And then we have the Americans involved. We always have the Americans involved. Once you've moved from the rating systems and you're starting, and this is the sort of vessel which starts to move beyond the rating system, because steamships start to take you away from the traditional rating system. There's a long time while the traditional rating system, which has ruled the day of Napoleonic Wars and several hundred years of Age of Sail, still sort of is part of it. But once you start to get steam power coming, and yes, the first steam power vessel is the Nemologus, which is a floating battery, or otherwise known as the Fulton, after its creator, Roger Fulton. It's an interesting ship, but it honestly isn't really one you would want to go to sea in. It isn't one you'd want to spend a lot of time on the water in. Because it's just not that stable. But it's useful. It's a starting point. And it even has an internal wheel to power it. So it's a sort of catamaran hull, and that wheel propels it through the water. A sort of catamaran hull. It's honestly a bit weird, but we'll leave that to one side. Thankfully, paddle steamers do get slightly more normal, and HMS Gorgon here is a good example of it. But there are problems with paddle steamers, and those problems are going to be in ship engines for a long time. They are more efficient than the initial propellers, theoretically. But you have these great big wheels on the side of your ship, which means there are places you can't put guns if you're going for an Age of Sail style frigate. And that means there are places which, frankly, you don't want to get hit. Because traditionally people have aimed for your mast, but to hit a mast is quite difficult. To hit a paddle wheel? Well. And HMS Gorgon, as beautiful as she is not a solution to that problem. But she's still a useful ship, and she's a beginning down the path which leads to more sustainable engines, which leads to more sustainable development. This is HMS Amphion. She is a screw propeller powered ship. We'll talk about propellers later on once we get to the turbina, but she's a very pretty ship. And the fact is, both these ships come into service after these ships do. And these are the test ships which the Royal Navy uses to work out whether they should be going propeller or whether they should be going oh, good lord. Paddle wheel. Helpful brain freeze there. So, propeller or paddle wheel? Rattler versus Electo. I think if this had gone a different way, well, we might be talking about a very different HMS Dreadnought. But the reality is, it was never really going to go that way. Rattler is built by some of the best engineers the Royal Navy can get their hands on. And there's no surprise there. Her tug of war contest showed that she could pull the Alecto backwards at a speed of 2 knots. She managed to outpace her in a round the UK race and also took part in a few other tests. It was a comprehensive testing series. It wasn't just this tug of war. Now, this tug of war did cause an interesting discussion in that people were wondering why other tug of wars hadn't been done. Honestly, by the time they get to the point where they might be considering other forms of propulsion, A, the ships have got too expensive, B, they've got too powerful, and C, you've got quite good computers which can do it a lot more cheaply and a lot more safely. But if you think about it, the test would be between thrusters and propellers, or rather impellers and propellers, azimuth pods versus shafts. It's honestly, most of the systems you're looking at aren't as disparate as propellers versus paddle wheels. They really aren't. And the fors and against aren't quite as dramatic as they are. So I think that's why you don't have it happen again. She even took part in some anti-slavery patrols under Commander Arthur Cumming. Served in the Second Anglo-Burmese War and fought a naval battle near Taiyou Village, Lantau, with Chinese pirates alongside HMS Eaglet and USS Portan. You can see it doesn't take long, though, for things to change. As things develop, well, if you've got engines, you can move a heavier ship. That's the advantage, especially when you've got engines and wind power. You can move a heavier ship, which means you can make the hull heavier. And that means you can start putting armor on it. Especially once you get used to the idea. Admittedly, the British do go through a phase of trying to stick copper on steel. You'll leave that to one side. Anti-fouling the bottoms. Anyway, the French go first. They get the Gloire into service. But she's a little slow, honestly. And they haven't been doing as much work as the British have been with armor, with engines, with guns. And it is all a very slow arms race. It really is a slow race for getting the better weapons, who can get the better, more powerful ships. And there's a reason for this. No one is really seriously building to take on the British, because it sort of works in people's favour for much of the 1800s that the British are the big power. The British are the big power, which means that any nation which might have decided they would be pro-Confederacy weren't really going to get involved in the American Civil War, because to do so, they need the British to get involved, because they're the only ones who could. And the British didn't want to. There might be some various people upset with the South being blockaded, but honestly, the British have been doing anti-slavery patrols and various other things off the coast of Africa for long enough by this point that really they weren't that keen on the idea of the Confederacy surviving either. So, not inclined. Hence, the 2 steam rams built for the Confederacy ended up being bought by the Royal Navy and having rather ignominious careers. It's also a factor that with technology changing at a actually very quick pace, And the interesting thing is, technology is accelerating faster than the pace of manufacture. So you might build a really powerful ship one year. Clarke can claim to be one of the most powerful ships in the world for a little over 6 months. And then the Warrior comes into existence. And Warrior is bigger, faster, more powerful. Did I mention faster? Longer ranged, prettier. And that isn't just the British in me speaking. Look at those lines versus the lines of Gloire. Look, the French will either design a very pretty ship or a very ugly ship. It's never anything in between. And as the scales of ironclad from the ironclad age go, and the ships from pretty to ugly go, Gloire is not exactly on the pretty end of the scale, is she? Whereas Warrior is rather pretty. Anyone would think she's designed with the idea of impressing the world whenever she wanders around it. But again, you have to remember, ironclad is a bit of a misnomer. It's kind of like armored carrier hangars, armored carriers. I tend to refer to them as armored hangar carriers. And whether you're talking about the Midways, the Taihos, or the Illustrious class, that's actually true because the armor tends to cover the hangar, not the full length of the ship. If you meet someone's going, oh, it's got armor from end to end, it actually doesn't. It tends to have armor over the central bit. And it's the same when you're looking at deck armor on battleships. They tend to have a slightly thicker bit over the center of the ship and thinner bits fore and aft. Starters for weight saving, but also because the more important stuff is in the center. And you can choose to be strong everywhere, in which case you're probably going to be weak everywhere because of weight. Or you're going to have a ship which is very, very low in the water. Or you can choose to be stronger in some places. With Warrior, they have a belt which covers the main battery area, which covers the engines, which covers the center of the ship, basically, for quite a hefty way. And that gives her survivability. That means that if she gets hit, if she's in trouble, even if she's taking on water in parts of the other parts of the ship, as long as the armored bit stays pretty much more air than water, she's probably going to stay afloat. Well, hey. And it's an armor sandwich as well. This is not a steel ship. You're dealing with an iron ship. This is, if I remember correctly, 4.5 inches of wrought iron backed by 18 inches of teak. And it's all made up with interlocking iron armor plates of 3 foot by 12 foot plates. That interlock is hug and groove style, actually, rather like my I might actually have some good demonstration tools here, rather like this. Yep. So that is what Warriors Propter by, and then 18 inches of teak, and that covers. Well, it covers all the area which has 68 pounders on it, but it mainly covers the roughly 213 feet, or that's 64.9 meters, of the center of the ship, and extends 4.9 meters above the waterline, 16 feet, and 6 feet below it, that's 1.8 meters. There's also bulkheads, which they have 4.5-inch armored iron transverse bulkheads to protect them. But the ends of the ship and the ship itself is 128 meters overall length. So, yeah, pretty much the remaining half of the ship, or 25% roughly, for a forward quarter and the aft quarter, aren't armored. They don't need to be. Then comes the Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, if you read some history books, they tell you this is when the armored ship comes of age. But honestly, people are building armored ships at this point. But this is this time. Let's talk about Clarke, Warrior, Monitor, Merrimack themselves. What they really are is the point at which people start to realize, hang on, things might have got problematic. The Merrimack is overwhelming to all the unarmored, unprotected ships. None of them can take her. But both her and Monitor are really too slow to be able to damage each other. So one of the interesting things, they are interesting designs, and honestly, both are very good harbor protection ships. Bombardment ships, battery ships. Rather in the mold of this lovely vessel. The Americans do have a history of coming up with some very interesting harbor protection ships. And the point is, they knock 7 bells out of each other. And then they go back to their own sides. I think Merrimack thinks Monitor's actually withdrawn, but Monitor's actually just having trouble steering. And Merrimack therefore goes away, and Monitor claims she's won, but honestly, neither side wins. And the fact is they couldn't, because Monitor could, if she had ignored the safety advice for her guns, possibly have penetrated Merrimack's armor. If she'd hit them. And you have to remember that she doesn't really have, and neither ship has the best trained crew in the world. Both ships are operating really in what you would call scratch crews, which could be trained up and would get a lot better as the war went on. What is the lesson that comes from Monitor and Merrimack, the Battle of Hampton Roads? Well, it depends on which navy you're talking to. The Royal Navy certainly looks at it and goes, turret ships would be useful. But the trouble is also they look at the low freeboard monitor and go, that could become an undesired submarine. At that point, they weren't really thinking about submarines that much. There was an interesting gentleman wandering around talking about submarines, but no one's really taking him that seriously. And that becomes the problem, because really, if you're British, what you want is the flexibility of firepower of the Monitor, because you want to be able to mount the heaviest gun possible to pierce the armor. But you can't carry enough of those guns as a broadside. And that's the real point. The guns start to get so heavy, the shells, everything gets so heavy, you can't carry a broadside of guns. It will cause you trouble for your ship. So you need to start carrying less of these guns, these more powerful guns that can actually punch through the armor, but you need a way to make sure they can engage targets, and that's where the turret comes in, because that gives you you can only have 2 guns, but you have 2 more powerful guns that you can guarantee will penetrate the target, but you have to rotate it around. So, of course, various turret ships come about as the answer. But you also have, quite quickly, the Battle of Lisa taking place. And this battle is kind of interesting in that you have ships of the line, which are almost traditional ships of the line, and rams, and various other, I would hesitate to call them ironclads, maybe semi-ironclads, taking part. And this is, of course, the idealized image of Tekkadhoff commanding his battle. The Battle of Lisa brings out three things. One, it confirms the idea of forward-firing guns, i.e., if you can present the smallest possible aspect to your opponent while concentrating as many guns as possible in that direction, you have an advantage. It's a tactical advantage. It can be a fleeting tactical advantage, but it's an advantage. And remember, this is still an age where they're sort of considering the idea of crossing the enemy's T, and that's, of course, what's going to happen at Battle of Tsushima, and is going to happen at the Battle of Jutland. And that means the enemy goes, you are the enemy's sort of sail along here, and you manage to sail along here, concentrate all your guns on them. Basically, the theory goes that if you have enough firepower forward, you could actually form your ship's line abreast, and therefore actually combat that sort of formation. But that takes a lot of skill, and I don't think anyone actually ever successfully achieves that. You could possibly suggest the Death Rider, the battle cruisers at Jutland, is an attempt at that, but I don't think we'd really count that. And this is HMS Devastation. This is one of the ships the Royal Navy comes up with, and it's a really powerful ship which stays in service for a long time. And its advantages are it's high enough freeboard, it's not going to end up becoming aquatic, but it's low enough freeboard, it's not really a good target, especially once they get rid of the mast it's originally fitted with. It has 4 powerful guns in these 2 big turrets, which have quite a decent field of fire. Not really that great forward, but enough. Has a sort of ram bow, but again, it's quite low, but it will do. And they're fairly flexible assets. And the point is, this is the first ship which is really, we don't need sail as well as steam. Because this represents the point at which steam engines start to become reliable. Yeah. We're in the 1870s. Steam engines are finally looking reliable. You can sort of talk about them as sort of becoming mature technology. And the reason isn't because of us not understanding steam. It's the metallurgy. The metallurgy of boilers, the metallurgy of pipes, the metallurgy of all the various systems which go into that rather large kettle that is a steam engine. And that takes time. It takes development. It takes experimentation. Often when I talk to students, and anyone initially, about steam engines, they focus on the components, but they don't think about the manufacture of those components. And that's something you have to consider about even to this day. There are engines and ideas for engines which we have, which we may or may not be able to make work, which might work on paper, but we can't make them work at the moment because we do not have the materials science to support it. Experimental physicists and those chemists, etc., and special engineers who work in material science are really, really critical people. You cannot overstate how critical they are and how long they've been around. Again, someone was telling me not long ago that, oh, material science, that's a product of World War II, and I was going, nope. Been around a lot longer than that. It's been around for a very long time, because material science is every level of history. You have the theoretical, you have the experimental, and you have the material. And here's a good example of what can happen when you bring the material science together with someone who's really very, very bright. Sir Giles Algernon Parsons, who not only was really bright, but actually was really very progressive and kind of a product of his era, in that he was an incredibly capable showman as well. honestly, if you're going to compare him to anyone, think of him as a slightly nicer Isambard Kingdom Brunel or Elon Musk. In that he is just as much a showman as both of those two have been. But he does it in a way and then gets away with it and people just clap and love him for it. He takes Turbina to the Spithead Review for Queen Victoria, races up and down, outpacing every ship sent to catch him, every launch sent to catch him, and instead of getting arrested, Turbina is turned into a museum exhibit at the end of her life, and you can go see her in Newcastle. Gets contracts from the Navy, gets contracts from the Royal Navy. Turbina is launched in 1894, though. So turbines and marine turbines are not again a new technology when Dreadnought is fitted with them. They are 10 years old. They've been around for a decade. Dreadnought is billed as this newness, as this great thing, and she is. But mainly the newness is the ideas coming together in a battleship form. What I also really like to example here is the propellers. And Turbina shares some history with our earlier vessel we talked about, our test bed. We go back to HMS Rattler. Both of them will be used to test various forms of propeller. Because, again, the metallurgy and shaping of propellers is being developed to make them more efficient, to make them stronger, to make them more resistant to the wear of the salt water and the effects of cavitation. These can all have an impact. Britain is very lucky, though, because we don't just have one manufacturer of turbines. Yes, we have Parsons, the original and often the best, but we also have John Brown Company who produce turbines. We have various other companies, Vickers, etc., which do a lot of development around turbines. So we have a lot of different sources developing and producing turbines, which helps with the pace of the development. One of the factors which you can talk about with HMS Dreadnought is her gun arrangement, where she has forward, 2 wing, then 1 and 1. So she achieves the same broadside with 5 turrets as the Germans achieved with 6. The reason she can do that is because the turbines have been developed by that point to such a position that they don't need to take up the same space that triple expansion engine system would, which is why the Germans have to have the extra set of wing turrets with all the consequential effects on performance, because wing turrets do have an effect on your performance. The whole point about steam turbines, though, is ultimately they are systems which are designed to extract thermal energy from pressurized steam in order to do mechanical work. Why am I chucking that in there? Because it takes a lot of effort to make that efficient. It takes a very complicated blade structure. It takes a lot of development to work out what type of steam turbine you want to do. Whether you want to do an impulse turbine, which is those blades with the vents, as you can see, well, the nozzles, and that's again another form of metallurgy and shaping on the nozzles, projecting onto the blades, or whether you want to mount the nozzles on a sort of disc and have them powering and going around. Or whether you want a combination of those. You might have blades in one part of your turbine. You might have nozzles onto blades in one type of turbine. You might have nozzles on discs on another part of your turbine. The point is, what you want the turbine to do will affect its design. Do you want a turbine which is going to be a low pressure, easy maintenance system for a merchant ship? Do you want it to be a high pressure, high speed, small system for a destroyer? Or something which can do fairly economical cruising for a cruiser or a battleship? Or do you want it to do high speed for fighting? All these things affect turbine design and affect cost of the turbine because they affect the materials you're going to use to design it and the intricacy of its work to build it. So this is Royal Sovereign, and why is she here? Why is she important? Because Royal Sovereign and her class represents the first class of battleships ordered en masse in this sort of scale. The British have ordered pretty much since the Napoleonic Wars. All the rest have been sometimes loosely grouped together, but pretty much been almost individual builds. Maybe a couple, maybe three. This is actually a large run of battleships. It's being built because Britain's having to look across the ocean and take, well, across the North Sea and go, what's Germany doing? What's France doing? What's Italy doing? The Russians are up to something. They're always up to something. What's America doing? They're having to look around the world because, again, naval races are very rarely binary. They are always, in fact, almost always, in fact, always global. Because even nations which aren't involved in that particular race can have an effect on the race because of the technology they push forward. I.e., the South American Dreadnought race has an impact on the European Dreadnought race, has an impact on what the Americans are building, which in turn has further impact on the South American Dreadnought race and on the European Dreadnought race. Everything goes round. And by the way, the reason I call it the European Dreadnought race is because there's Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Britain all taking part. Even the French occasionally add something in there, but we'll leave that French to one side and try and put that involvement a long way away. Try. Barfleur is important because whilst, yes, one of the Royal Sovereigns will have turrets, Barfleur is one of the first classes, well, Centurion class, and this example is HMS Barfleur, are one class specifically designed and built with turrets. One of the things you notice of the pre-dreadnoughts is that they are designed for close quarters combat. There is technology being developed for range fighting, but it isn't presumed battleships will be at range because you're going to need to get close to guarantee hits with guns. Again, it's to do with the metallurgy of the barrels. Okay. As the metallurgy improves on the barrels, yes, you can start to get more reliable range because they're starting to be less affected by the heat. They're still going to be affected by the heat of firing the guns, but they become less affected, so they stay on a target for longer and stay lined up for longer, in which case you can actually achieve the longer ranges. You can take the pressure with enhanced metallurgy of the explosive, so that allows you to actually fire a larger charge, which allows you to hit the target which is further away. It's all metallurgy. You can have the ideas for a better ship. In 1892, the RN could have built probably something not too dissimilar to what emerges as the Germans' first Dreadnought style ships, with those 6 twin turrets. But there was no point. That's a lot of expense to put into a single hull, and at the ranges it's going to engage at, That's not help. It's far better to have more hulls and spread the guns around, because that's your survivability. It's the old 70% versus 100% solution. If I have sufficient infrastructure that I can build 70% to your 200%, well, yeah, you've got two individual ships which individually can beat any two of mine. But the odds are you're going to have one of yours available at any one point, and I'll have three of mine. Which means your 100% will be facing my 210%. And yes, you might have a 6-gun ship. Let's say you build that 6-turret ship, 12 guns, but the broadside's going to be 4. I have those same 6 turrets spread on 3 ships. And the broadside is going to be 6 turrets, 12 guns. And you can point all your guns at one ship, but that means the other 2 are going to be completely unmolested, firing away. That is the mathematics of warfare. That is the mathematics of naval strategy once you get down to fighting. That doesn't mean you should always pursue the 70% solution over the 100%. Because if you're the weaker power, the 100% can make a lot of sense. For example, the Suffren and the Kaiser Karl de Grosse. Kaiser Karl de Grosse's secondary gun is pretty much the same as its primaries, it's just a shorter caliber. A smaller caliber. This vessel, instead, has lots of smaller guns. What's the difference? I would say this is a ship being designed for the idea of a general melee, where it's going to have to take on enemy cruisers and possibly enemy destroyers. This is a ship which is designed to take on enemy battleships. It's presuming they're going to have armor to resist pretty much everything apart from the most powerful guns it can carry. This is your 100% solution. This is arguably your 70% solution. But the French need to build a lot more of these to be able to outmatch this. Because of that. Because at the range that the French can close to engage with these guns, that can have a far more devastating impact. Especially as if you look at them and consider them for a broadside, well, the Battle of Lisa hasn't really impacted them, has it? They haven't got the guns forward. They are broadside ships. They're supposed to engage in line of battle, rather like, well, the theoretical ideal of the age of sail, which all sensible admirals who win battles tend to seem to ignore if they want to win a battle decently. But at the same time as you have those lovely pre-dreadnoughts being built, or White Star battleships, named after the British designer, who designed quite a few of them. You also have armoured cruisers developing, and does that hull remind you of anything? Those lines? The gun placement? Yes. Because what are the ships which are being focused on high speed and long range fire at this point? Armoured cruisers. They're supposed to... If you're talking about building a ship, a battleship, that's going to be getting close and pounding away. But armoured cruisers are about scouting and trade protection. They're either going to be running away from an enemy fleet to get the information back to you, or they are going to be chasing down a commerce raider. That's their policy. So, yes, they might not be able to deal with this and fight in the extended ranges we think about Dreadnought and later Dreadnought-style battleships engaging at, but these are the long-range, high-speed ships being developed. And it gets even more clear once we look at her successor class, the Duke of Edinburgh class, and this example is HMS Black Prince, and HMS Dreadnought. When you realise the wing turrets, the style of bridge, Dreadnought is a scaled-up armoured cruiser. She doesn't come from nowhere. The turbine has been in development, and the fact is, having the turbines by 1905, 1904, 1905, when they're making decisions, means that they can achieve speed for a battleship. They can go to 21 knots. They actually did think they could actually maybe push her higher. They did think about it. Again, one of the things you always have to remember about HMS Dreadnought is she's built incredibly quickly. Why? Because unlike with Warrior and Gloire, the British weren't prepared to just build the best as soon as someone else had built it, even though you can argue it might have been strategically more sensible. They wanted to get there first. They wanted to make a statement to the world. They didn't want anyone, i.e. America, Germany, or Italy, getting there first and being able to claim this. So they go with what is available. They go with the design they know is high speed and capable. The armored cruiser design. And they scale that hull up. They go with turbines. And they go with not the most cutting edge turbines available, but some fairly new and very respectable designs. So a very mature and capable design that they can absolutely rely on. They go with the 12-inch guns, which are available thanks to the ships already in construction, rather than maybe going with a bigger gun, which was available from other sources. And they even adopt, as has been pointed out, the armoured cruiser layout and don't go for a super firing second turret on a set of 4.5 turrets, which technologically wasn't that impossible at the time because they didn't want to wait and didn't want to think it through. A good game to play sometimes when you're looking at technology and you want to evaluate it in your mind is if someone's saying this was cutting edge at the time, look around at what was actually the cutting edge bits and go, And this is where the Battle of Tsushima comes from. If they're not cutting edge, if those bits aren't cutting edge, but they're close to cutting edge, then it might not be the emphasis is on building the best you can possibly build at the time. The emphasis might be on building the best you can build quickest. Because the Battle of Tsushima happens. And Britain knows everyone else is going to react to it. Because everyone else has been reading the same tea leaves the British have. Everyone else has been thinking the same things the British have. They know what's coming. They know what people are doing. They're not stupid. And they don't presume their opponents are. This is one of the strange points in history, is when you get people who have to be binary. One side is good, therefore the other side is bad. One side is smart, therefore the other side has to be dumb. No. It's never. Well, it's never one side smart, one side dumb. Sometimes one side is bad, but that doesn't necessarily make the other side good. Possibly makes them just less bad, or less worse. The point is, the Battle of Tsushima happens, and Britain's going, and Fisher, Admiral Fisher, is going, I have the answer. I've been writing about this for years. All big gunship. We need to get this done as quickly as possible. Really as quickly as possible. Okay. So they start. And they've already started construction, but he's got all the things put aside, and he's got the guns ready to go. He's got turbines ready to go. He's got everything already in place. He's got the yard picked out, which is the yard he ran when he was in charge of the dockyards. And he gets it through as quickly as possible. Does that make Dreadnought any less impressive? No. Does the fact she wasn't the latest and cutting edge of turbine technology make her less capable? No. What would the cutting edge of turbine technology probably got her? If we consider when those turbines were actually mature, or were considered mature and viable and were put into ships, the speed increase that happens, you could probably have said she could have been about 23, 24 knots. And again, if we go with, okay, so the 12-inch gun, what would have been available? Well, the other one is the 14-inch from Ellswick's Ordnance Company. But those guns would have been ordered, they'd have had to be tested, approved, and built. And frankly, the 12-inch were available and were good enough to do the job. And the job was this. They were deploying the world's first all-big gun battleship. Which is, of course, a misnomer because, well, first rates and second rates and third rates are all going, well, we're all big gun. Okay, yes, our cannon of various sizes, but they're all quite big guns. But no. What it means is a uniform main battery. And again, HMS Warrior could point her hand up in the air and go, excuse me, but I was designed with a uniform main battery, as could Douglas, the Rogers Fulton's ship for the Americans, but don't let marketing get in the way of good history. Or rather, history get in the way of good marketing. And she's a very capable vessel. Another point. The other thing we're going with the 12-inch guns. They already have ships which have the 12-inch guns. They have crews which know them. Again, you are more likely to bring the ship quickly into service if you go with technology which whilst cutting edge is not the tippiest tip of the cutting edge. Rather than being the tip of the spear of cutting edge, it's the head. Okay? And that is what we're looking at with Dreadnought. We're not looking at the tip of the spear. The tip of the spear could take them much further. When you're looking at it later on, the tip of the spear, even the Queen Elizabeth class, are arguably not quite the tip of the spear of what Britain could have produced at the time if they wanted. In fact, no one ever really does build the tip of the spear. Because it's very expensive, and because, and this is the really important thing, it's often the most finicky point of its development. HMS Dreadnought comes into service. She not only sets the world ablaze, she's a practical ship. She's a viable ship. She does a few operations with, a few wander around with some of the Duke of Edinburgh class, etc. armoured cruisers. Because they all look these modern, sleek ships. They look like a modern car manufacturer's lineup, you know, where you've got the small model which has the same sort of front end as the really big saloon car and the other big cars, so they all look like they're scaled up versions of each other. Well, they were because ultimately Dreadnought, rather like HMS Victory, rather like all the battleships built in Spirit, Warrior, is a political statement as much as she is a naval combat asset. Turbines, by the time she's come into service, have been around, I said, for 10 years. Steam engines for longer than that. Turreted guns, you're talking 40-ish years. 40, 50 years. all these things are not really new. What's new is the combination of them all. And what's groundbreaking is the cumulative effect of that combination. The speed advantage she has, which means she can cross the T of your fleet. The firepower advantage she has. Again, 3 Dreadnought, even the German one, even if we ignore the fact that the central battery of the vessel discussed earlier is shorter range than the other 2 turrets, the 4.5 turret. That's 6-gun broadside. This is an 8-gun broadside. 8 big, long-range guns. Most pre-dreadnoughts, they can't match that. That's twice most pre-dreadnoughts can even think about offering. Forward firing, he's got 6 guns, which is 3 times most pre-dreadnoughts have. And more guns than many pre-dreadnoughts have broadside, in terms of if she's engaging from maximum range. She also has a sort of ram bow, which will claim a victim in her career. Some friendlies as well. But mainly claims a German submarine. Yes, she is also one of the world's largest anti-submarine warfare vessels, because she actually achieves a sinking one. But there you go. That's how we get from Trafalgar to Dreadnought. That's how we get from ships which have hundreds of guns, as their statement as a first rate, to a ship which has 10 guns and is considered the first rate. And I could just imagine if you turned round to Admiral Collingwood or Nelson and told them, you know what, in 100 years from now, the most powerful battleship in the world, and it'll be the most powerful battleship in the world for 18 odd months, if not longer, will have just 10 guns and only be able to fire 8 in a broadside. They would have probably looked at HMS Victory and gone, have you been getting the supply straight from the East India Company lately? Anyway, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've enjoyed discussions that have happened. The Battle of Myanmar will be coming at some point. I am really trying to make sure my Korean pronunciations are proper. And what's coming up next week is Sherman's March to the Sea in a long patrol. Take care and hope you enjoyed. I'm going to go out on this one rather than the usual one, because I just think it's cool. And it's a lot of fun.